Putin cannot believe what Trump has just done to him. He thought he and Trump would be buddies, but oh boy was he wrong. Instead, he stabbed him where it hurts the most. In this video, we will explore how Trump's actions may cause the collapse of Putin's regime sooner than you might think. In a strategic move to expedite the end of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, President Donald Trump is focusing on a critical pressure point: Russia's oil revenue. By urging OPEC and Saudi Arabia to lower oil prices, Trump aims to diminish the financial resources that fuel Moscow's military operations. In a recent address, Trump emphasized the urgency of this approach, stating that reducing oil prices would force Russia to reconsider its actions in Ukraine. He has called upon Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to take immediate steps to decrease the cost of crude oil, thereby limiting Russian state revenues. This strategy aligns with Trump's broader foreign policy, which leverages economic measures to achieve geopolitical objectives. By diminishing Russia's oil income, the U.S. seeks to weaken Moscow's capacity to sustain its military operations in Ukraine. However, the effectiveness of this approach depends on the cooperation of key oil-producing nations and the dynamics of global oil markets. While the U.S. continues to provide substantial military aid to Ukraine, targeting Russia's oil revenue represents a complementary strategy to exert pressure on the Kremlin. As the situation evolves, the international community closely monitors the impact of these economic measures on Russia's actions in Ukraine. The success of this strategy could set a precedent for using economic tools to address international conflicts. In summary, President Trump's initiative to lower oil prices aims to undermine Russia's financial ability to continue its military campaign in Ukraine, complementing ongoing military support efforts. While Trump's pressure on oil prices is a major economic weapon, it is not the only method the U.S. is using to undermine Russia's ability to sustain its war. The Biden administration's parting gift to Trump, a sweeping crackdown on Russia's shadow oil fleet, has already started crippling Moscow's energy exports. And Trump is expected to go even further. Recent U.S. sanctions have targeted over 180 oil tankers, crippling a third of Russia's crude export capacity. This is a direct blow to the Kremlin, as Russia has been skirting Western sanctions by using a network of aging tankers to transport its oil to China and India at discounted prices. Now, with these vessels blacklisted and major insurance firms refusing to cover Russian shipments, Moscow's options are shrinking fast. But Trump's strategy doesn't stop at squeezing Russian oil sales. He is expected to ramp up secondary sanctions on countries and companies that assist Russia in bypassing restrictions. This means not only blocking Russian energy shipments, but also going after Chinese and Indian buyers who continue to facilitate Moscow's war economy. For Russia, this is a nightmare scenario. Its entire war effort is financed by oil sales. Without a steady stream of petrodollars, the Kremlin will be forced to either cut back military spending or resort to extreme financial measures, such as printing money, which would send the Russian economy into freefall. At the same time, Trump is expected to push for expanding U.S. liquefied natural gas (LNG) exports to Europe, permanently replacing Russian gas supplies. Since the start of the war, U.S. LNG exports to Europe have surged by over 3,700%, and Trump plans to solidify this shift, ensuring that Europe never returns to relying on Russian energy. Moscow knows what's coming and it desperately needs an escape route. This is where China comes in. Russia hopes that by strengthening its energy ties with Beijing, it can cushion the blow of U.S. sanctions and oil price cuts. But here's the problem. China has its own agenda. While Beijing is happy to buy discounted Russian oil, it is not willing to completely alienate the U.S. or Europe. And Trump is betting that by ramping up pressure, he can force China to pick a side. What will happen next? Will China continue to prop up Russia's war economy, or will it cave under U.S. pressure? The Biden administration may have spent the last few years imposing sanctions on Russia, but Trump is now looking at a much more aggressive strategy, one that hits Moscow where it really hurts. While sanctions have limited Russia's economic flexibility, they haven't crippled its ability to sustain the war. The real Achilles heel of Russia's war machine is its energy sector, and Trump knows it. That's why he's preparing to choke Russia's oil revenue at the source, forcing Putin to choose between war or financial collapse. During his campaign, Trump repeatedly stated that lowering global oil prices would be the fastest way to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. His logic? Russia funds its military primarily through oil exports. And if the price of crude drops below $45 per barrel, Putin's entire war strategy collapses. Trump has already signaled to Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus that they need to ramp up oil production, flooding the market and driving prices down. But this isn't just a simple price adjustment, it's economic warfare. The strategy: Trump's plan to collapse Russian oil profits. Here's how this strategy directly attacks Russia's war funding. 1. Crashing oil prices. Russia's budget is heavily dependent on oil, with nearly 40% of its revenue coming from energy exports. If prices drop to around $45 per barrel, the Kremlin won't be able to sustain its military expenditures. 2. Pressuring OPEC Plus. Trump has stronger ties to Saudi Arabia than Biden ever did. He knows how to leverage influence over the kingdom, and he's already warning them that cooperation will be key in ending Russia's war. 3. Expanding U.S. energy dominance. The U.S. has ramped up LNG exports to Europe, reducing the continent's dependency on Russian energy. Trump aims to permanently replace Russia as Europe's top energy provider, cutting off Moscow's last reliable market. With Europe already shifting away from Russian oil and China and India only buying at deep discounts, the Kremlin is running out of options. If Trump successfully pressures Saudi Arabia to lower oil prices, Russia will be forced into an economic crisis that it cannot escape. Even Moscow's propaganda machine can't spin this reality. Putin's government desperately needs oil prices to stay high, and without steady revenue, the war effort will become financially unsustainable. That's why Trump's real battlefield isn't Ukraine, it's global energy markets. And if there's one thing Trump understands, it's power moves. Putin is starting to realize the walls are closing in. Russia's economy is built on oil, and Trump's strategy threatens to pull the rug from under the Kremlin. But Moscow isn't just sitting idle. It's scrambling for ways to counteract the economic assault. The problem? Russia has very few real options left. With Europe cutting itself off from Russian energy, Putin desperately turned to China and India. But there's a problem. Even these so-called allies are playing hardball. They're buying Russian oil at a massive discount, and if Trump manages to pressure OPEC Plus into flooding the market, Russia's only two major buyers will be paying even less. This is an economic death spiral that Moscow cannot afford. Russia's failing counterattack. Putin's strategy to escape the oil price trap relies on three high-risk maneuvers. Weaponizing gas supplies again. The Kremlin could try to hold Europe hostage again by cutting off the remaining gas flows and forcing a crisis. But the difference now? Europe doesn't need Russian gas anymore. The US has already stepped in, and alternative supplies are securing the continent's energy needs. Increasing dependence on China and India. The Kremlin is attempting to deepen its energy ties with Beijing and New Delhi, but both countries know Russia is weak. China is exploiting Moscow's position, dictating terms, and India is following suit. The result? Russia's profits are being squeezed even harder. Expanding the shadow fleet, Moscow's so-called ghost tankers have been dodging sanctions by using fake paperwork, off-the-radar shipments, and ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean. But Trump's administration is already looking into ways to shut this down completely. If U.S. sanctions start targeting these vessels, Russia's black market oil trade could collapse overnight. The nightmare scenario for the Kremlin: Putin knows that Trump's policies could force him into a no-win scenario. If oil prices drop too low, the war effort becomes financially impossible to sustain. That means less money for weapons, less cash to pay troops, and rising unrest inside Russia. Even Russian officials are starting to panic. Some within the Kremlin are already leaking concerns about the long-term sustainability of the war. Moscow is seeing a record deficit, and even with desperate tax hikes, Putin cannot replace the revenue loss from energy exports. This is not just an economic crisis, it's an existential threat to Putin's war machine, and Trump knows it. Putin is running out of moves. His options are shrinking, and now his so-called allies are turning their backs on him. Russia wanted to weaponize its energy supply, but the West adapted. Now it's Russia that's being cornered, forced to sell oil at massive discounts while Trump's economic war tightens the noose. And let's not forget, Moscow still has to fund its war in Ukraine. So what's Putin's next move? Desperation. The Kremlin's last-ditch plan: desperate economic warfare. If Trump succeeds in slashing oil prices, Putin will have no choice but to lash out in other ways. Moscow has three high-risk tactics left: weaponizing the ruble. The Kremlin could artificially inflate the Russian currency by using its limited reserves. This is an old trick, but it's a dangerous one. It drains Moscow's financial resources even faster. The last time Russia tried this, inflation skyrocketed and businesses suffered. If Trump's plan works, the ruble could become worthless. Cyber warfare and energy sabotage. When Russia loses on the battlefield, it shifts to hybrid warfare. The Kremlin could intensify cyber attacks on Western energy infrastructure, trying to disrupt global markets. There's also the risk of physical sabotage, such as attacks on pipelines and oil facilities. But here's the problem. Western intelligence agencies are already preparing for this. Any direct attack would trigger massive retaliation. Hoarding gold and alternative reserves, Moscow has stockpiled gold to hedge against Western financial sanctions. But this isn't a long-term solution. Russia still needs foreign currency to pay for imports, and with its economy shrinking, Putin can't keep burning through reserves forever. The real power move: Trump's energy leverage over Moscow. Trump's energy dominance strategy is not just about oil, it's about economic control. If the US secures Europe's long-term energy future, Russia loses its biggest leverage. This is why Trump's focus isn't just on oil prices, it's also about locking Russia out of global energy markets permanently. Europe is moving toward total independence from Russian energy. The European Union is already working to completely phase out Russian LNG by 2027. If this happens, Russia will permanently lose one of its largest customers. The US is stepping in as the world's energy supplier. America's LNG exports are skyrocketing, and Trump's policies could accelerate this even further. The US is positioning itself as the only real alternative to Russian energy, which means that Moscow will struggle to find new buyers. India and China will eventually demand even lower prices. Russia is already selling oil at a discount to these countries, but if the global market is flooded, they will squeeze Moscow even harder. Putin is walking into a financial disaster that he cannot escape. For all of Putin's talk about Fortress Russia, the reality is simple. Moscow's economy is built on oil, and Trump is getting ready to smash that foundation. The next few months will decide whether Russia can survive this new economic onslaught or if it will finally start collapsing under its own weight. And Trump knows it. Putin's nightmare: the US and Europe lock Russia out of global energy markets. If Putin thought sanctions were tough before, he's about to learn what real economic warfare looks like. With Trump cracking down on Russian oil sales, Europe accelerating its phase-out of Russian LNG, and US energy exports flooding the market, Moscow's entire economic model is at risk. Putin built his power on energy dominance. That's over. Europe's total Russian energy ban is nearing completion. European imports of Russian oil and gas have collapsed, and the few remaining buyers are getting ready to cut the cord completely. The European Union has already pledged to eliminate Russian LNG by 2027. If this happens, Putin will lose over $50 billion in annual revenue. Forever. The US is expanding energy dominance. Under Trump, the US is ramping up oil and natural gas exports, especially to Europe. This is a direct replacement for Russian energy. Every additional US LNG shipment means one less Russian ship docked in European ports. India and China will continue squeezing Russia, Russia desperately needs buyers, but China and India are exploiting this weakness. They are demanding heavier discounts and getting Russian oil for 30% cheaper than market rates. As more energy supply enters the market, these countries will squeeze Putin even harder. Putin's desperation is showing, and the cracks are growing. Putin knows what's coming and he's scrambling to delay the inevitable. His last options are military escalation. When Putin loses economically, he turns to military aggression. Expect more missile strikes on Ukraine, cyber attacks on Western infrastructure, and nuclear threats. Shady oil smuggling networks. Russia will try to disguise its oil shipments through shadow fleets and third-party brokers. But Trump's expanded sanctions on tankers and insurance companies are already forcing Russia to take massive losses. Panic in the Kremlin. Putin's inner circle is terrified. His economy is collapsing, his energy leverage is disintegrating, and the West is finally applying the kind of pressure that could break Moscow. If oil prices drop too low, Putin's war machine won't survive. The next 6 months could be the most important period of the entire war. If the US and its allies push hard enough, they could force Russia into a crisis that Putin cannot escape. And once that happens, Moscow's downfall will accelerate faster than anyone expected. For decades, Putin's energy dominance made him untouchable. Oil and gas profits fueled Russia's military, bribed its allies, and kept the Kremlin in power. Now, that empire is collapsing. The West's new energy strategy is the final blow, one that will leave Russia weaker than ever. How the US and Europe are cutting off Russia's lifeline. Putin's biggest source of power isn't his army, it's his energy revenue, and the US and Europe know it. That's why they've launched a full-scale economic war to crush Russia's energy sector. The US is flooding the market. By expanding oil and gas production, the US is undermining Russia's grip on global energy prices. As American exports rise, Russia's ability to manipulate the market is vanishing. Europe's energy shift is almost complete. The European Union has permanently cut off most Russian oil and gas imports. Now, with Trump pushing for an even tougher stance, the few remaining Russian energy links to Europe will be erased. India and China are exploiting Russia's weakness. These two countries pretend to be Moscow's allies, but in reality they're bleeding Russia dry. They're demanding cheaper and cheaper prices for Russian oil, knowing that Putin has no choice but to comply. The result? Russia's energy profits are shrinking fast. Putin's losing hand, and his growing desperation. With energy revenues collapsing, Putin is running out of moves. Russia's economy is on the brink. The Kremlin is burning through cash reserves, but the cracks are spreading. Sanctions are working, and Moscow's financial system is under immense pressure. The Kremlin is turning to dangerous measures. Putin is forcing Russian companies to fund the war, increasing military spending beyond sustainable levels, and draining the country's wealth to keep the invasion going. The oil market is shifting away from Moscow. As more nations pivot away from Russian energy, the long-term consequences are devastating. Putin won't just lose profits, he'll lose influence. Russia is running out of time, and Putin knows it. This economic war isn't just about money, it's about survival. If oil prices fall, and if the West maintains pressure, Putin will lose the ability to fund his military machine. And when that happens, Russia's defeat will become inevitable. The question isn't if Russia's energy empire will collapse, it's when. Putin's silent panic. Russia's economy is bleeding out. Despite all of Moscow's propaganda, the truth is Russia is running out of financial lifelines, and Putin knows it. Right now, the Kremlin is burning through its reserves at an alarming rate. Russia's budget deficit in 2024 reached over $40 billion in just the first quarter. Military spending now consumes over 40% of the Russian budget, pushing the economy toward unsustainable debt. Russia's oil revenue has dropped by over 30% compared to pre-war levels, despite its best efforts to bypass sanctions. Putin is desperate. His government is falsifying economic data to hide the real damage, but analysts see through the lies. The war is draining Russia dry, and every month that passes puts Moscow in a weaker position. And here's where Trump's energy plan comes into play. The former president has made it clear, lowering oil prices will crush Russia. With OPEC under pressure and the U.S. poised to increase its energy dominance, Putin could soon face his worst nightmare, a global energy market that no longer favors Russia. The Kremlin's problem? It has no backup plan. If China and India push for even lower oil prices, Moscow will be forced to sell at a loss. If Saudi Arabia cooperates with Trump, Russia's only major export collapses overnight. And if the West strengthens energy sanctions, Putin's budget crumbles entirely. Moscow is cornered. Its economy is being bled dry, and while propaganda might delay the truth from reaching the Russian people, reality will eventually hit, and when it does, Putin's regime could face internal collapse. Now, the biggest question is this: what desperate moves will Russia make to delay the inevitable? That's exactly what we'll explore next. And that's where things stand. The U.S. is tightening the economic noose around Russia, cutting off vital revenue streams and forcing Putin into a dangerous game of survival. Meanwhile, Ukraine holds the line, knowing that time, economic pressure, and strategic alliances could finally tip the scales in its favor. But here's the real question. Will this economic war be enough to break Moscow's war machine, or will Putin find another way to keep his invasion alive? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe to War Agent right now. This war isn't just about battles on the ground, it's a global power struggle, and we're here to break it all down. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and like this video because staying informed is more important than ever. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.